Hello everyone, it's Channin here for Honeybee Stamps. In today's video, we are going to create this really pretty wintry holiday card featuring the lovely layers Winter Greenery Dies, but with a somewhat untraditional palette. We're going to start out by taking a quick look at the Winter Greenery die set here. There are a bunch of dies in this set. We're going to use several, and we're going to combine it with these beautiful palette of blues and oranges. I started by die cutting the stick here out of that navy cardstock. I die cut 3 of them. Now I'm going to move on to these pine branches, a small and a large, and I'm going to die cut them out of the navy cardstock again, but I did add an adhesive sheet to the back side of the cardstock. So after I die cut these are basically like stickers, and they'll make that really easy to stick them down onto our card front later. And I did die cut 2 small ones and 2 large ones. Now we're moving on to our medium blue cardstock. I also added an adhesive sheet to the back side. Then I'll grab the same 2 pine dies and die cut 4 as well, 2 large and 2 small. And again, they have that backing on them, so they'll be really easy to stick later to the card front. Now moving on to these holly leaves, I'm going to die cut them out of my light blue cardstock, and I do die cut a bunch. I cut out 8, but I actually used 9 for today's card. And then for the berries, I'm going to use a light orange and a darker orange and just die cut 2 sets of those and put them aside. Now that we have all of our foliage die cut out, I'm going to move on to the sentiment. I have the Joy Honey Cut set here. I'm going to start with the smallest Joy and die cut it out of white cardstock. Now that I've die cut that out, I'm going to move on to one of the shadow layers using the medium one here, and I'm going to die cut it out of some vellum. This is just going to make that Joy a little bit easier to read and pop out from the background. I simply am just going to adhere my white die cut Joy directly on top of my vellum Joy. And again, this will just kind of make it a little bit easier to read or separate it from the background. I did apply some liquid glue and then pressed off the excess onto a scrap piece of cardstock, and now I'm going to stick it onto the vellum. Then I'll finish by adding the little tittle for the J and just pick that up with my tweezers and stick that down. Now that we have our Joy ready to go, I'm going to create a sub-sentiment. I have the Joy 4x4 stamp set here. I'm going to use the And Piece stamp from that set, stamp it onto some of that light orange cardstock, apply some anti-static powder. Now I'm going to ink up the stamp in clear, embossing and watermark ink, stamp the cardstock, and then of course dip it into some white embossing powder. I'll then tap off the excess and then heat set with my heat tool. Now that my sentiment is heat set, I then went ahead and trimmed it down to a sentiment strip off camera. Now we're going to adhere this strip onto the die cut Joy. I'm going to add some liquid adhesive to the right side of the sentiment, and then I'll just stick it right down over that Y, and that will keep those two together and make it a little bit easier when we start to assemble all of our die cuts on the card front. Now I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending. I have Faded Jeans Distress ink here, and I'm going to completely ink blend these medium blue pine branches. They're just a little bit too bright blue for me, so I toned them down a little bit with that Faded Jeans. Now I have a small panel here, a little bit smaller than an A2 panel. It is 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and I'm going to start to frame around my sentiment with my die cuts. I started with some of the pine branches and then moved on to just the plain kind of sticks, and now for those sticks I'm going to adhere my holly leaves to them. I added a little bit of liquid glue to the top of the stems of the holly leaves and then tucked them under the branch, and that will just kind of stick those two together, and again just kind of make it a little bit easier to work with and know where I'm going to have those leaves so I can frame that sentiment a little bit better. So I'm going to continue to work around and glue these leaves to the stems and till I have all of my holly leaves, all 8 of them, glued to the branches. And once I finish with this one, I'll move on to the bottom one and I'll glue 3 of those holly leaves to that one as well. And every once in a while I'll have to trim off some of the stem of the holly leaf if it's kind of poking out and looking a little bit strange. But for the most part, I can tuck that thin stem behind the branch pretty easily. So I just finished gluing all my leaves down and I finished my arrangement. So now I'm going to grab a piece of press and seal and carefully place it over all of those die cuts and my sentiment, pick them up with that press and seal, and then I'll remove it from the panel, flip it over, and we're going to add some foam adhesive, and we're going to add it to the holly leaves and the sentiment. That's going to pop those leaves up a bit and also of course pop up that sentiment, and it'll just kind of balance it out a little bit but the pine branches will stay flat. They'll be adhered to the card front, directly adhered to the card front. So I went ahead and added my foam adhesive to my holly leaves as well as my sentiment. And now I have a doubled up strip of white cardstock here. I'm just going to trim it down to a couple little pieces, and I'm going to add this to the back side of my sentiment strip. I'm doing this to just kind of balance that sentiment strip out a little bit because it's overlapping our doubled up Joy die cut, and it just would be a little uneven and wonky if I were to just add the foam adhesive directly to the sentiment strip. So this will just kind of even things out a little bit with that doubled up strip of cardstock, and then I went ahead and added foam adhesive to that sentiment strip as well. Now I'm just removing the backing on all of the foam adhesive, and now it's time to remove the backing on the adhesive sheet. So I'm going to go around to all of these pine branches and remove that adhesive backing, and then we'll be ready to stick this down onto our panel. So I'm going to grab that panel here, grab that press and seal with all my die cuts, center it, and then press it down and press all around to press down all of those die cuts nice and firmly to that light blue panel. So now I'm just going to carefully remove the press and seal here, and after we get that removed, we'll pick this up and then trim off all the overhang. I like to use a long bladed scissors for this and just hold it up against the edge of the panel to make a nice clean cut on all of those die cuts. Now save those little scraps because you're going to use those to kind of fill in some of the areas. I noticed like at the top there, my branch kind of didn't stick, so I have to stick that back down. So I have that resting there right now. I'm using some of the pine needles to kind of fill in some of the open areas. This is just where you can kind of take some creative liberty and just kind of make, you know, this frame as full as you'd like it to be. I'm just going to add a little bit of liquid adhesive to the backside of that branch and stick that down. Add a little bit of liquid adhesive to the backside of that little branch that was already stuck down, but it wasn't quite stuck down enough. Then add a little branch to that leaf there, just kind of balancing things out. Some of the leaves, the holly leaves, felt like they needed a little bit more of the branch, so I added that. Now I'm going to trim off any more of the overhang that I might have made by filling in some of those openings. And I actually decided that one more leaf up there needed a little bit more of that branch. So I added a little bit of liquid adhesive to one of those scrap branches that I trimmed off. And then I'll just trim off the overhang. So now we have our frame pretty much done. The only last thing we have left to do is to add all of our orange berries. This is where it really starts to connect the color in our sentiment and just kind of complete the whole look. And I'm just adding some of the light orange and some of the darker orange around the three kind of holly sections. And you can see I did add one more holly leaf to the left side there and with one of the berries just because I felt like it was a little unbalanced. And I did pop that leaf up with foam adhesive just like I did the other ones earlier. Now I'm going to finish up with one last berry here, and then we're going to move on to finishing this card by adhering this panel onto our card base. But it already looks so pretty as is. I love the blues and the orange together. Super, super pretty. So I just quickly grabbed an A2 top folding white card base. Now remember, this blue panel is a little bit smaller than an A2 panel, so that's going to make a nice border around that panel, which I think also frames it and just kind of scales it down a little bit. And here is the finished card. I'll hold it to the camera here and get a good look at all the details. I really do love how this card turned out. The palette is so pretty and modern, yet it still has very much a holiday feel. I hope you guys enjoyed today's card and video. If any questions about the products I used, please check out the links below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.